Today we're going to look at topic 3, interdependent relationships in ecosystems. This will be approximately 25% of the Regents exam. This section has a lot of vocabulary, so it might be beneficial for you to make some flashcards so that you can make sure you're memorizing the correct terms. First up, we have carrying capacity and limiting factors. We're going to be looking at different scales and using quantitative data. When I see that word quantitative, what I like to do is break it down into the word quantity. Remember, there's going to be a lot of vocabulary, and if we can kind of find those chunks that we know, it's going to make it a lot easier. Whenever I see quantity, I know I'm talking about number. What we're going to be doing is looking in the passage. We're going to be looking in the data table, in the graph, in order to grab those numbers to help us better answer the questions. All right, so what words am I putting on flashcards? Probably carrying capacity, finite, limiting factors, abiotic, and biotic. Let's go over what all those things mean. We have carrying capacity. First up, I've got that word capacity, and when I think about the word capacity, I think max number. If you ever look in an auditorium or you look in a movie theater or maybe your cafeteria, you will see it says capacity. And then it has the number of people that it can hold. Well, the carrying capacity is that same idea. It's looking at the number of organisms an ecosystem can hold. And remember, for the ecosystem, we're looking at the number of organisms that can live in a forest, let's say. And some of those are going to be well-defined areas, and then other ones not so much, depending upon the scale. So carrying capacity, max number. What's the max number of organisms and populations that ecosystem can support? How do you determine what that max number is? That has to do with the limiting factors. Again, that would be another good word to put on a flashcard. A limiting factor keeps the population in check so that it doesn't get too big. And that's all going to be determined by the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of competition, the amount of space available for these organisms. A limiting factor is finite. That word finite looks a lot like infinite. Infinite means unlimited, but if we take off the in, we actually wind up with the word finite, which is the exact opposite, limited. In any sort of environment, there's going to be a limited amount of food. There's going to be a limited amount of water. And the two different types of limiting factors are going to be called abiotic and biotic. I like to break apart words, like here I have abiotic. I highlight the bio. I do know that bio means living. And then the A is going to negate that. So therefore, that means non-living. Non-living things include boundaries, which could be space, climate, so what's the temperature like, what's the rainfall like, and then the last one's going to be water. Obviously, there are other examples as well. These are just going to be a few. And water is like water available for the plants, water available for the animals that live there. Abiotic, non-living. Another vocabulary word is going to be biotic. So we already have that definition for bio. We know that that's referring to living things. Living things could be food. And you might be like, well, my food's not living. But think about it. Plants, when you eat them, living. The organisms that you eat. If you eat any sort of meat, chicken, chopped meat, steak, fish, those are all things that were once living. So those go in the biotic category. We have competition, different organisms competing over the same resources. So you both need water. You're fighting over the water. You both need space. You're both fighting over the space. So the competition that you have with other organisms is going to be considered biotic. Predation is talking about the things that are eating you. Things eating you keep your population as a species from exploding. And then the last one is disease. Disease is living. Think about things like bacteria, for example. Bacteria are living. They infect you, and then you wind up getting sick. Disease is spread more easily when organisms are living close together. We can think about an example of when industrialization came about. People moved to cities. Cities didn't have good sanitation. And because of that, because people were living in such tight quarters, that allowed disease to spread more easily. Now, human-induced changes can either go in the abiotic or the biotic category. Human-induced, many times we're also going to call that anthropogenic. Big word, but if we can just remember anthro means human, like I have here. And every time we see anthro, we just write down human. We can think about what are the things humans are doing to negatively affect the ecosystem. That could be like cutting down trees, deforestation. That could be burning fossil fuels. That could be polluting the oceans, right? All of those are going to be examples of things that are anthropogenic. And some of those anthropogenic things are going to be biotic, like the cutting down of trees, and then other ones are going to be abiotic, like polluting water. All right, so finite resources affect the abundance or number of organisms of a species in any given environment. When they're talking about quantitative data, I'm thinking maybe you'll get a graph like this. One thing about this graph is that while the axes are labeled, they don't have any, numbers either on the time or the population size. So all we really can deduce from this is general trends. Looking here, this is time. Is this over 10 years? Is this over 20 years? Is this one season? We honestly can't tell. But we do know that this is going to be over a period of time. And then what we can see, even though there's no numbers listed, is that we have exponential growth that kind of eventually levels off. This dotted line here, B, is going to be referred to as the carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of organisms that can live in that environment. You might say, oh, it went a little bit above and a little bit below, though. So you said that that's the carrying capacity, but I see there's a spike. That, when it goes up and down, that word is called fluctuates. And I remember on a test we had, a few people had a hard time with that. Fluctuates, again, just means up and down, up and down, up and down. But what you'll see is that when it's fluctuating, it's in a really narrow band. Many times that could be due to seasonal variations. In the springtime, it's rainier, grass is growing, you got lots of leaves on the trees, you start to get vegetables and fruits that are produced. So food, especially for herbivores, winds up being plentiful. If there's a lot of food for herbivores, that means there are more herbivores. If there's more herbivores, that means there are more carnivores, because carnivores have more herbivores to eat. So this increase slightly above the carrying capacity could be like, hey, we're having a good year. There's lots of plants around, and therefore lots of herbivores. And then as you move through the year, right, we come to the summer, and then eventually we come to the fall. In the fall, it winds up getting colder. The trees lose their leaves. There's not as many vegetables and fruits growing. Therefore, there's less food available for the herbivore. And because of that, their number decreases. And then again, cyclical, right? Where we have those fluctuations occurring a little bit up, a little bit down. They do talk about how we're looking at scale. So different scales. A forest supports 500 deer when food, water, and space are abundant. But when we all of a sudden have a drought, now there's not as much vegetation or not as much producers or plants available for the deer. And because of that, this ecosystem that used to be able to support 500 deer can only support 300 deer. So that would be one example of something that could affect the carrying capacity. Another thing is maybe there was a really, really good spring where there was tons and tons of rain. So therefore, you get a little bit of an increase, and then that rain dries up and you're in a drought. There's a little bit above 600 deer, but now those deer are overgrazing the land. And overgrazing just means eating too much of that vegetation. There's not enough vegetation available to sustain 600 deer. And because of that, you have increased mortality. And increased mortality, that mortality is just referring to death. All right, following that, we've got biodiversity. Once again, for any of those words, this would be another one I'd stick on that flashcard. Bio meaning life, living things, and diversity meaning differences. So we're looking at the number of different organisms in a given area. The more biodiversity in an ecosystem, the more stable an ecosystem is. When we're looking at biodiversity, we can also think about it like number of connections in a food web. The more connections there are, the more stable that ecosystem is going to be. Because if one organism dies off for whatever reason, the other organisms still have food available to them. So the more different organisms in an ecosystem, the more stable that ecosystem is. The environments or habitats that are going to be very biodiverse would be any sort of forest, so like a rainforest, temperate deciduous forest. Ones that are not diverse would be something like the desert. And that's because there's less producers in the desert. And since there are less producers, there are less herbivores and therefore less carnivores. So places that have mid to high level of biodiversity are going to be ones that have lots of vegetation, because then that can support lots of herbivores, which then can support lots of carnivores. Here we have two examples of different scales in terms of biodiversity. As you've probably seen where you live, maybe there used to be like a forested area and they went and they cut that down in order to build houses or to build like commercial areas. When that happens, the things that used to live in that forest, whether that be birds, deer, mice, chipmunks, now they have nowhere to live. Because of that, that's going to reduce biodiversity in that area, that one specific town where they did that. For global, we could look bigger scale, like what's happening with birds in terms of climate change. Remember, climate change is going to be when you have more carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. And since you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that causes the global temperature, right, to go up. And also it can affect how much rain areas get, if an area is in a drought or has a surplus of water. That is going to potentially change the migration route of birds, and therefore the birds that used to live in one area no longer live there, and that could reduce biodiversity in that area. Biodiversity is increased by the formation of new species. Evolution can cause speciation, which is when you get new species arising because of environmental pressures that select for the best traits. Remember, organisms don't get things because they need them. They get them because there at some point was a random mutation that was beneficial for those organisms, and they had a better chance of surviving and reproducing and therefore passing on that trait to the next generation. Biodiversity is decreased because of extinction. When you destroy habitats for organisms, they most likely are going to go extinct because they have nowhere to live anymore. The next one that we have is the degree of disturbance determines the degree of ecological change. So let's define that word disturbance. Disturbance is a disruptive event that causes changes in an ecosystem. Disturbances can either be human, caused by humans, or they could be naturally occurring. We have different levels of disturbances as well. Some of them will be a low-level disturbance, and then some of them will be high-level disturbance. Forest fire disturbance. When we're looking at the Albany pine bush, which was one example, the Albany pine bush has what's known as a controlled burn. And that's so that we can wind up keeping the flowers that the blue Kerner butterfly are going to use for food, so we can make sure that they stay there. So you have a controlled burn, which is when people light fire intentionally under controlled conditions so that they can clear the underbrush, and therefore that does not harm the mature trees. This is beneficial because it increases plant diversity, and it also reduces the risk of larger fires. So it keeps things under control. Local governments do this intentionally. Then we have high disturbance. High disturbance would be a severe wildfire that burns thousands of acres, destroying canopy and soil structure. Ecological change would be loss of habitat, soil erosion, and long-term shifts in species composition. I mean, you could also think about this maybe if we're not talking about a forest fire, but the one we talked about in hourglass was Mount St. Helens, which was a volcano in 1980. And even now, 40 years later, the ecosystem still hasn't gotten back to where it is. But over time, gradually, right, 40 years, it has made some improvement in terms of vegetation. But all of that soil erosion and loss of habitat, it takes a long time to reestablish itself. Another example of disturbance could be human development. Again, we're looking at something that's anthropogenic. Low disturbance is a boardwalk trail, is built with minimal land disruption. Ecological change, slight changes in animal movement patterns, but ecosystem remains intact. High disturbance is that humans drain the wetlands, like in Florida, for housing or agriculture. That collapses whatever used to live there, right? Organisms used to live in those wetlands. We drained them. They were wet areas, so aquatic food webs are completely lost, which therefore reduces the biodiversity in that area, and then it increases the flooding risk. If you're putting your house or your business on an area that was once a wetland, it's probably, initially really wet and more likely to have flooding. Next up, we have complex interactions in ecosystems maintain relatively consistent numbers and types of organisms in stable conditions. Right? Relatively consistent numbers. And that has to do with our carrying capacity, and those limiting factors keep those numbers relatively stable. Changing conditions may result in a new ecosystem. So you have a fire, it burns down all the things. That's going to make a new ecosystem in that area. We have two examples of ecosystems that can shift potentially dramatically when environmental stress exceeds resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover. Right? If someone's resilient, they could overcome the various obstacles that they face. Ecosystems are the same way. Ecosystems can be resilient and go back to what they once were, but other times that's not going to be possible if the environmental stress is too much. Our first example is going to be ecological succession. This picture is a classic picture from the Regents. One thing that you want to note is that this is over time. This is not all supposed to be the same area. This is bare land right here. This bare land means maybe it's rock or dirt. Eventually what happens is you wind up having grass growing, so you have a field. After a field, you wind up getting some shrubs. You can have a pine forest, and then finally a hardwood forest. This has the most biodiversity. Most biodiversity means most stability. The most different types of organisms can live here. Another thing to note is going to be that each ecosystem makes the soil better and better for the next one. And that's going to be because some of the grass dies off, those nutrients get recycled back into the soil, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And then it is more suitable for the shrubs. When the shrubs, some of them die, again, you wind up getting a soil that's more suitable for the pine forest. And then eventually, when some of those things die or the pine needles fall, that's going to make the soil, that topsoil, more and more nutrient rich. When we're referring to nutrient rich, we're actually referring to those atoms or elements. The chan or the hank. So stable conditions, a mature forest maintains consistent species and nutrient cycles. That's what we have here. Most biodiversity, and then you wind up having the decomposers here in the soil that are recycling the chan. Disturbance, wildfire, you cut down the trees. There's that volcano that we looked at that resets the succession. Succession means each of these ecosystems is replacing the last one. New ecosystem. If climate or soil conditions change significantly, the new climax community may differ. So it is possible If it's very extreme, you might never get back up to there. But it's also possible that given 100, 200 years, you can get back to that last picture. Another example, which I did not go over in class, is grassland to desert transition or desertification. This could be overgrazing and drought. They give a specific example about a region in Africa, and that's because there's been a lot of soil erosion. That soil erosion winds up making it so that there's not a lot of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in that soil. If there's not a lot of those nutrients inside of the soil, it's going to be hard for those plants to grow back. New ecosystem, when plant cover is lost, the ecosystem can no longer support the same organisms. The system transitions from a grassland to a desert with fewer species and lower productivity. So therefore, we wind up having less biodiversity, and less biodiversity means less stability. Solutions for reducing the impacts of human activities on the environment and biodiversity. Biodiversity again means number of different organisms living in a given area. Adverse impacts of anthropogenic changes. When I see that word anthropogenic, again, I'm going to break that down. Anthro meaning human, genic meaning producing. Even if you can just keep that anthro part human, anthro, human, that's going to really help you. If that winds up being like in the multiple choice or if it's in a short answer. I have just a few examples. There are many examples. My biggest piece of advice is that you're probably just going to have to keep going back into the passage to find the information. Go into the passage, go into the data table, go into the graph. First up, we have urbanization. Urbanization is looking at the fact that we're building more. That could be we're building more houses, we're building more factories, we're building more commercial space, whether that be a grocery store, a Target, buildings. We have habitat destruction, pollution. Pollution can include water pollution, air pollution, and it also can include thermal pollution. Over-exploitation is when you use a resource faster than it can be replaced. Now, for every impact that we have, you're going to want to have some sort of solution. I always like reduce, reuse, recycle, or some sort of green energy or alternative energy. Those work real well. Other things you can think about, urbanization. You have a city, even a small city, right? You can create areas where this is a park. If it's a park, maybe there's some trees there. You could set up a nature preserve, and therefore you can still have things like deer, rabbits, chipmunks, squirrels, bugs, birds, all of those things living in that area. Enforce emission standards and promote public transportation. If you live in an area that has really good public transportation, you should think about taking advantage of that, or even taking the bus to school. That would be an example of public transportation, which is going to reduce your impact. Encourage water conservation, energy efficiency, and recycling programs. That just goes back to reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce your energy use, reuse different products that you buy if possible, and then recycle whatever things like metals or plastics through your local trash collection. Next up, we have building dams. Building dams, they block the water. So it alters river ecosystems, blocks fish migration, changes sediment flow and water temperature. Solutions, you can build something so that salmon go from one area of a river to another. And if you have a dam, they get stuck, they can't go where they need to go. So if you can have a little pathway so that salmon can actually migrate where they need to go, that's better than just putting a roadblock there, because then that's going to reduce the number of salmon in that area. Eco-friendly dam design, incorporate environmental flow releases that mimic natural river conditions. So therefore, the river still does somewhat flow, And then alternative energy. Instead of building dams in order to generate electricity, we can invest in solar power, wind power. One thing that's not on here is also nuclear power. We did talk about that in class. Nuclear power is good because it doesn't generate carbon dioxide. It is bad because obviously there is radioactive waste, which people are concerned about. Dissemination of invasive species. Oh, let's just add nuclear power. Dissemination is just a fancy word. That fancy word means spreading. Invasive species means that those organisms did not initially live there. Since they did not initially live in that ecosystem, they can outcompete the organisms that do live in that area. Many times that's going to be because they don't have any natural predators. So there's nothing to keep their numbers in check. Some solutions, ecosystems. You should be checking ecosystems. Check ecosystems and act quickly to remove new invasives. If you are monitoring, especially things like, let's say, riverways, waterways, and you're like, oh man, that organism's not supposed to be here. If you could get that in check sooner rather than later, be proactive instead of reactive, that would be good. Inform people about not releasing pets or plants into the wild. Biological control. This is like a little bit dicey because you go and get the natural predator of that organism and then you release it into the area where you have the invasive species. But now the question is, when you do that biological control and you release that natural predator, what's eating that natural predator? So now maybe you got two problems. You got your initial invasive species, and now you have a secondary species that you just brought in. Enforce controls on the water inside of the boats, imported plants, and firewood movement. Inside of firewood, you can wind up having pests. And when you transport it from one area to another, you might wind up having that pest inside of your firewood, and then that affects all the trees that live in your area. So usually firewood has a really narrow distance that it can be moved from one area to another. The big one's climate change. Climate change is going to be due to increase in atmospheric CO2. When we're talking about atmospheric CO2, that's primarily due to the combustion or burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Climate change causes a shift in where species are going to live. It can increase coral bleaching, increase ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is talking about how much carbon dioxide is inside of the ocean. More carbon dioxide in the ocean causes it to be more acidic. More acidic can lead to things like fish kills, where lots of fish all die. Coral bleaching, remember we talked about how that is caused by an increase in temperature of the ocean. The temperature is increasing because of that. The water temperature of the ocean's increasing because we have that atmospheric carbon dioxide increasing. And then increased frequency of extreme weather. Things we can do. Use renewable energy. Many of those we already talked about up at the top. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower. Improve energy efficiency. Create wildlife preserves to help species migrate as climate shift. Use drought-tolerant crops and sustainable farming practices. Reforest degraded lands and restore wetlands to sequester carbon and buffer climate impacts. Sequester, we're just talking about to trap it. So maybe you have a field and you can replant trees on that field, and therefore those trees can use the carbon dioxide in order to undergo photosynthesis. Last part says sustaining biodiversity is important because it ensures that functioning and productivity of ecosystems are maintained to support and enhance life on Earth. It also aids humanity by preserving could mean saving, keeping, landscapes of recreational or inspirational value. Constraints, remember constraint is going to be a limitation. When developing solutions. This is what we did with the bird lab, where we were dropping the clay from different heights. A constraint is always going to be cost. How much is it going to cost a company in order to put this in place? Then we have safety, reliability, aesthetics. Aesthetics is what something looks like, and then also environmental impacts. Evaluating potential solutions for maintaining stability includes considering the trade-offs. Trade-offs are the pros and cons. Why is this beneficial or not beneficial? And for many of them, I have the solutions up here, how you could increase biodiversity, and then you can look at the positives and negatives. A big con for all of these is going to be the cost involved. The last one, which goes with this standard, which we actually talked about in evolution but can also fit here, is group behavior. Group behavior has evolved because membership can increase the chances of survival for individuals and their genetic relatives. I have 3 examples. 1, fish schools. That just means when lots of fish are traveling together, and that's going to help reduce predation and also increase foraging efficiency. Foraging is referring to looking for food. Here I have some numbers. When you are in a school of fish, you have 50% lower predation rate than if you're by yourself. Because for whatever reason, you look bigger to the other fish, and therefore they are scared and don't try to eat you. But if you're hanging out by yourself, you're a pretty easy target. Group foraging increases food detection by 30 to 40%. So those are the pros of group behavior. Now there could be some negatives. 1, while schooling reduces predation, sometimes larger predators see those and then try to go after them. But again, overall, your chance of surviving is higher if you're in a group of fish, which is called a school, as opposed to just by yourself. The other one we have is elephants form herds to protect young and share knowledge of resources. Positives, herds led by older females have higher calf survival rates. What scientists have done, they've used GPS tracking to show how the herds more efficiently find things like water during droughts. Negatives, human interference. We watched a video about how humans have been poaching elephants in order to get their tusks, and therefore the older ones that have the tusk, they get killed, and they can't actually, they can't mentor their younger ones, so therefore, how is that affecting calf survival rates? And the last one, 3, is trying to use a plant, so we know we're not just talking about we're not just talking about animals. Some bamboo species flower simultaneously, all at the same time, across vast areas, even if they are geographically separated. So all of these bamboos flower at the same exact time, releasing lots of pollen, and therefore you're going to wind up having lots of flowers, or a lot more bamboo, right, are going to be in a given area right after that mass simultaneous release of the pollen. Positive, certain bamboo species flower only once every 40 to 120 years, then die. This mass flowering overwhelms seed predators, increasing seed survival. Negatives, while it does boost reproduction, it also means all of them die simultaneously. So you get a lot of reproduction happening, but then at the same time you get a lot of death happening. And it's good because then more of these seeds are surviving, but it's also bad because then all of the established plants are dying off at the same time.